As Keefe D's Tupac murder trial unfolds, he's now talking about Snoop Dogg. And some of what he's saying is raising serious questions about Snoop Dogg's connection to the case. But there's one detail involving Snoop that's drawing more attention than anything else. Let me explain exactly what is happening here. Keefe D's murder trial began this week, happening almost exactly 30 years after Tupac was gunned down near the Las Vegas Strip. This isn't a documentary. It isn't a podcast episode. It isn't another celebrity interview. This is a Nevada courtroom unfolding right now with a jury, a judge, and a man who spent decades talking about this killing, now facing a first-degree murder charge with the use of a deadly weapon. The trial is happening in a Nevada courtroom almost exactly 30 years after Tupac was gunned down near the Las Vegas Strip. Prosecutors say Keefe D planned the murder and supplied the gun used to kill Tupac. Though they say he's not the man who fired the fatal shot, he's pleaded not guilty to everything. Jury selection began with the judge questioning a pool of prospective jurors about conflicts, medical issues, and language barriers that could keep them off the case, while Tupac's family and fans gathered outside the courthouse. From there, things moved quickly, opening statements, then straight into witnesses who were actually there on the night Tupac died. And this is where things get interesting for anyone who's followed this case over the last 2 years, because the witness list released before the trial looks like a snapshot of that entire era of hip-hop. Additional names in the document include Kirk Burroughs, the founder of Bad Boy Records, Paula Clements, Davis's wife, and Eugene Deal, Diddy's bodyguard, alongside Yusuf Jah, the co-author of Davis's 2019 book, and Leonard Jefferson, who photographed Tupac and Suge in the car just minutes before the shooting. Other names listed include Trayvon Lane, who was involved in a brawl with Tupac at the MGM Grand hours before the shooting following a Mike Tyson fight, and Rashena Smith, Orlando Anderson's girlfriend, the man long viewed as a prime suspect in the case. Suge Knight himself, the man sitting beside Tupac in the BMW when the gunfire erupted, is also named on that list. Nevada Governor Joe Lombardo, who was a Las Vegas Metro cop when this case was still fresh, is expected to testify as well, alongside members of Shakur's family and documentary filmmakers who've spent years pursuing this story. And that matters because every familiar name could add a piece to a story that has remained unresolved for decades. Now, pay attention to who's missing from the defense table, yet keeps getting mentioned. Snoop Dogg was part of Death Row Records when all of this happened. The label run by Suge Knight that signed Tupac and also had Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg on its roster. And while Knight developed a reputation for using or threatening violence to control things, that's not just background. That's the exact world this trial is attempting to rebuild. Sentence by sentence, witness by witness. On the first day, Keefe D's own lawyer said his client walked out feeling good. His defense attorney, Michael Sam, described him as hopeful, saying he's in a good place right now. That's a strange thing to hear from a man facing life in prison. But it tells you something about how confident the defense feels heading into a case that's almost entirely built around Keefe D's own words. Because that's the real twist of this trial. There's no murder weapon. There's no getaway car sitting in an evidence locker. There's no surveillance footage of the actual shooting. The jury will not have a murder weapon, getaway vehicle, or surveillance video of the shooting, but they will have Keefe D's own statements, the book, the podcast appearances, the documentary interviews, the words he gave to police over almost 2 decades. Prosecutors said outright in a filing that almost all of the evidence they plan to introduce exists to establish the credibility of the defendant's various accounts of his role in Tupac's killing. In other words, this case lives or dies on what Keefe D said about himself, and by extension what he said about everyone standing next to him that night. And that's exactly why Snoop Dogg's name won't leave the conversation. Every time Keefe D opened his mouth over the last 20 years on BET, in his memoir, on podcasts, he wasn't just talking about himself. He was describing an entire world of people connected to Death Row, to Suge Knight, to the days right before and after Tupac died. Snoop Dogg was one of the biggest names inside that world. So when people ask whether Keefe D is finally going to reveal something real about Snoop Dogg, what they're really asking is whether this trial will finally pull back a curtain that's remained half open for almost 30 years. Prosecutors have already presented their theory of what Davis was doing that September night. Prosecutors say Davis was the shot caller of the group that fatally shot Tupac and wounded Knight in 1996, and he's the only person among them still alive. Every other person allegedly inside that white Cadillac, including his nephew, Orlando Anderson, long suspected as the actual shooter, is dead, which means Keefe D isn't simply a defendant here. He's the last living witness to his own version of what happened. And the prosecution is betting the entire case on proving that version credible enough to convict him, while his defense is fighting to prove it was all created for a book deal and a Netflix moment. That tension, a man who spent 2 decades talking about a murder, now on trial for it, insisting the very words that made him famous were fiction for profit, is the engine driving this entire case. And it's that same tension that's been pulling Snoop Dogg's name back into headlines for more than a year now. Ever since a man serving decades in another California prison decided he had something to say about it, long before jury selection ever began. The loudest voice connecting Keefe D to Snoop Dogg wasn't Keefe D at all. It was Suge Knight. The former Death Row Records boss was calling from prison, making one allegation after another. Suge Knight claimed that Snoop Dogg was secretly trying to bail Tupac murder suspect Dwayne Keefe D Davis out of jail. He made the accusation during an interview with The Art of Dialogue, telling the podcast that ever since he'd been locked up, Snoop and other people had been trying to get Keefe D released because he was talking too much. When the host pushed him to explain what talking too much actually meant, Knight didn't back down. He brought up Snoop, brought up Ray J, and brought up Sean Diddy Combs in the same breath, saying all of them had ties to Puffy and that the more Keefe D talked, the more they stood to get hurt by the situation. That's a serious accusation to make from a prison phone. Knight wasn't simply saying Snoop felt sympathy for an old friend from the neighborhood. He was suggesting Snoop had something to lose if Keefe D kept talking and that bailing him out was a way to manage the problem. Knight didn't stop there, either. He went after Snoop's own account of Tupac's final days, insisting Snoop never actually visited Tupac in the hospital after the shooting. Knight said flatly that never happened and called it a lie. That mattered because Snoop had told that hospital story publicly before, describing arriving at Suge's house in Vegas, seeing Suge with his head wrapped up, and being told Tupac would pull through because he'd survived being shot 9 times once before. Snoop didn't stay quiet about it. He immediately took the fight to Instagram, firing back at his former boss, and saying Knight kept bringing him up because he couldn't handle the fact that Snoop now owned Death Row Records. That one statement worked on 2 levels. It rejected the bail claim while reminding everybody that the label Knight built from nothing now legally belonged to the very person he was attacking, and that ownership detail matters. Snoop bought the legendary company in February 2022, while Knight has repeatedly questioned whether the deal was legal, even though he has never shown evidence proving it wasn't. So whenever Knight accuses Keefe D of talking too much, another battle seems to be happening beneath the surface. It's a deeply personal struggle over who truly gets to control the Death Row Records legacy. The label where Tupac, Snoop, Dr. Dre, and Suge Knight made their names together before everything eventually collapsed. Online, the response exploded almost instantly. Fans poured into the comments beneath the repost of Snoop's statement, bringing the label's entire past back into the spotlight. The Dog Pound, Michelle Liu, Nate Dogg, every name connected to Death Row's rise and fall surfaced, with plenty of people arguing that the label carries some kind of curse Snoop inherited the instant he purchased it. Knight wasn't finished. In that same wave of comments, he outlined what he claimed he would do to Keefe D if they ever landed inside the same jail cell. Portraying it as retaliation for information he said he was uncovering about certain things. It's the kind of threat that sounds less like idle prison talk and more like a man deliberately signaling that he knows what Keefe D could potentially reveal and wants everyone to understand just how angry he is about it. But before going further, it's important to separate what is actually documented from what is simply being claimed. Suge Knight's accusation that Snoop Dogg was trying to get Keefe D released from jail has never been supported by a court filing, bail record, or documented effort. No one has produced a receipt, statement from an attorney, or bond paperwork showing Snoop Dogg put up money or used influence to secure Keefe D's release. What we actually have is Suge Knight's word against Snoop Dogg's, playing out through prison phone interviews and Instagram comment sections. But here's the reason the accusation continued gaining attention. Keefe D really had been talking. That part is not disputed. For years, he gave interviews, appeared in documentaries, and published a book laying out his version of what happened in Tupac's murder. Whatever Suge Knight's reasons were for pulling Snoop Dogg into the controversy, the underlying reality remained that Keefe D had spent 2 decades publicly describing what he said happened that night and identifying the people who were around him. Those statements are now part of the wider story surrounding the murder case in Las Vegas. That's the connection between the prison feud and the courtroom. Suge Knight was pointing toward a book, and that same book has become part of the conversation surrounding a murder trial. To understand why Snoop Dogg's name continues circling this controversy, you have to go back to 2019, when Keefe D published his account of Tupac's murder in Compton Street Legend. Co-written with Yusuf Jah, the book opens in Las Vegas on September 7, 1996, with a detailed account of Keefe D's plan to confront Tupac and Suge Knight in retaliation for an earlier fight. He wrote that he obtained a gun, climbed into a Cadillac with 3 other men, and drove around searching for the 2 of them. When they spotted Tupac's car, he wrote that they pulled alongside it. No words were exchanged. The moment for talking had passed, and something was about to happen. That passage is now almost word for word the foundation of the state's case against him. That account has become the central evidence against Davis as he faces trial in one of America's most notorious unsolved murders. He wrote about leaving the scene and abandoning the rental car afterward, described himself and Knight as the only 2 people still alive who were there that night, and ended the account with a warning that real gangsters are not people to mess with. Davis has said writing the book was therapeutic, and he described the proffer agreement he'd reached with federal investigators years earlier as the deal of a lifetime. The arrangement allowed him to speak without fear of being charged because, in his words, he never told on anybody except himself, since everyone else involved was already dead. That detail matters enormously for the Snoop question. Keefe D's entire public story for nearly 2 decades was built around the idea that he could speak freely because the only people he was implicating were dead men who could not legally be prosecuted anyway. Snoop Dogg was never dead. Snoop Dogg was never one of the men inside that same Cadillac. So, whatever Keefe D has said or hasn't said about Snoop Dogg was never protected by that same logic, which is exactly why any mention of Snoop Dogg in his account carries more legal weight than his descriptions of Anderson or the other men who are now completely gone. Now, this is where the story takes a brutal turn. Since his arrest, Davis has changed his position on his own book. He wrote a tell-all detailing his role in Tupac's killing, and now he claims it wasn't true. His defense argued the book should be excluded from the trial entirely, insisting it was fictionalized for money and raising questions about which sections he actually wrote himself because it carries a co-writing credit. He's even gone so far as claiming he never read his own memoir, arguing his co-author took the raw material from his life story and took it somewhere else alone. The judge handling the case rejected that argument. Nevada Judge Carly Kearney ruled the statements in the book could be introduced at trial, finding that Keefe D had essentially adopted the material as his own by promoting it, discussing it, and refusing to disavow it until charges were brought against him. That decision is the pivot point this entire trial turns on. Every allegation Keefe D made in that book about the shooting, about Suge Knight, about where everyone was and what everyone did is now available for prosecutors to place into the record as his own admission, whether he wants to accept it or not. And that includes any detail tying the world surrounding death row records to the planning and aftermath of that night. The label Snoop Dogg was signed to at the time. Beyond the book, prosecutors are also leaning on years of media appearances Keefe D gave afterward. He gave his first on-camera confession years ago on BET's Death Row Chronicles documentary series, describing himself sitting in the front seat of a white Cadillac in Las Vegas. When someone sitting in the back seat opened fire, he refused to identify the shooter directly on camera, citing the code of the streets, but confirmed the 2 men sitting in the back seat were his nephew, Orlando Anderson, and a man named DeAndre Smith. That interview alone was enough to put fresh pressure on Las Vegas police, triggering a petition signed by thousands demanding the case officially be reopened. Even his latest, most defiant public statements have only made the picture harder to understand. In a televised interview following his arrest, he maintained his innocence, said he'd turned his life around, stopped selling drugs, found new friends, and simply wanted to watch his grandkids play football and basketball rather than remain behind bars. Yet in that same breath, he claimed he'd never truly read the book carrying his name and argued that every previous interview, every piece of writing, and every earlier statement about his involvement was ultimately about moving books and collecting money. So which version should anyone believe? The detailed account laid out in Compton Street Legend, or the present-day claim that the entire story was created for profit? That's exactly the conflict this jury has been asked to untangle. And hidden inside that same web of conflicting statements is everything Keefe D has ever said, publicly or privately, about the people surrounding Suge Knight back then. A circle that included Snoop Dogg, one of death row's biggest stars. While Suge Knight was making accusations from behind bars and Keefe D's book was being dissected inside a Nevada courtroom, Snoop Dogg has spent this entire saga shaping his own version, one that reaches back to the actual hospital room in Las Vegas during the week Tupac was shot. Snoop Dogg's account begins in the same place as Keefe D's. September 1996, Las Vegas, immediately after the shooting. But Snoop Dogg has always told the story from outside the car, never from inside it. That detail remains central to the version he has repeated since. During an appearance on Logan Paul's Impulsive podcast, Snoop Dogg described driving to Vegas to see Tupac, first arriving at Suge Knight's house before getting anywhere near the hospital, and being told by Suge Knight himself, his head wrapped in bandages, that Tupac would survive because he'd already been shot 9 times before. That's the same story Knight later branded a lie, arguing Snoop never even came close to that hospital. From the outside, there's no clean way to resolve that contradiction. It's one man's recollection of a chaotic week versus another man's firm denial nearly 3 decades later, with both men having reasons to present events in whatever way serves their version. Still, it matters to consider what each man gained by framing it that way. Snoop's version casts him as a grieving label mate hurrying to stand beside his friend. Knight's denial makes Snoop look like someone exaggerating a bond with Tupac that may never have truly existed. Snoop's public response to the claims about talking too much and bail followed that same formula. Brief, pointed, and delivered himself instead of through lawyers or representatives. His entire reaction to Knight's allegations amounted to one Instagram comment, rejecting the accusation while firing back with a shot about who really controls death row records. To this day, he hasn't given a lengthy interview explaining the bail allegation in detail, hasn't issued a statement through a publicist, hasn't taken Knight to court for defamation over it. He's handled it like most of Knight's accusations over the years. Background noise from a man left with little besides a prison phone and decades-old grudges. That same pattern becomes even clearer when you examine the broader relationship between the two men. Knight built death row around artists, including Dr. Dre and Snoop, while operating the label with a reputation for using or threatening violence to keep people obedient. He served nearly 5 years behind bars for assaulting a man shortly before he and Tupac were shot, and he's now serving a 28-year sentence for a 2015 hit and run that killed a man in Compton, with parole not available until well into the next decade. Every accusation Knight has made against Snoop over the past year and a half has come from that same cell, from a man with decades remaining to serve, and by his own admission, plenty of resentment over how death row's legacy ultimately ended. Snoop, meanwhile, has spent the years since Tupac's death building the kind of career longevity nobody in that Cadillac or BMW ever got to have. He's transformed death row from a label drenched in violence and lawsuits into something he now owns outright. And he's embraced being one of the most recognizable, most bankable figures in hip-hop, largely by staying several steps removed from the street politics that consumed so many of his former label mates. That separation is exactly what makes Knight's accusations hit the way they do. Not because there's solid evidence supporting them, but because they touch the one thing Snoop has spent 30 years trying to keep separate from his image, any direct fingerprint on what happened to Tupac. It's also worth remembering that Snoop wasn't unfamiliar with serious criminal proceedings himself. Years before any of this, he stood trial in the mid-1990s on murder charges tied to a shooting outside his own apartment, a case that became a flashpoint in the national debate over whether gangster rap reflected actual violence or encouraged it throughout American culture and communities for years afterward, too. He was acquitted. That history has no direct connection to Tupac's murder, but it explains why even the slightest suggestion of his name around an active homicide case still carries weight. For an audience that remembers just how close he once came to a completely different outcome, none of that amounts to evidence that Snoop played any role in what happened to Tupac, and nothing revealed through the current trial's witness list, evidence filings, or courtroom testimony has put him at the scene or identified him as a suspect in any capacity. What it does explain is why his name keeps getting dragged into the orbit of this case whenever it resurfaces, because he was one of the last major figures still standing from that entire Death Row Records era. Still wealthy, still visible, still owning the very label whose violent past continues being re-examined inside a Nevada courtroom 3 decades later. As of this week, Keefe D's trial is underway, moving into its second day with testimony from witnesses who were actually there the night Tupac was shot. His defense team has portrayed him as hopeful, even comfortable, as he moves deeper into a case the state has spent years constructing largely from his own words. The stakes for him personally could hardly be higher. If convicted, Keefe D faces life behind bars for a killing he spent 2 decades describing in interviews, documentaries, and a memoir he now insists was written for money rather than truth. The prosecution doesn't need a smoking gun locked inside an evidence room because they've built their entire argument around showing that his repeated descriptions of that night, given again and again over 20 years, amount to a confession the jury can believe more than his present denials. For Snoop Dogg, the stakes are different, but they aren't insignificant. His name isn't on the charging document, isn't identified among the men prosecutors say pulled the trigger or organized the ambush, and hasn't appeared in any court filing connecting him to what happened that night. Yet whenever this case moves forward, a new hearing, a new witness, a new headline, his name gets pulled into the discussion again because he's one of the few surviving figures from that entire death row era who's still alive, still famous, and still directly connected to the label sitting at the center of it all. That's exactly what the last year and a half of prison phone allegations, Instagram responses, and podcast revelations have been revolving around. Suge Knight's claims about a secret bail effort were never supported by paperwork or testimony, and nothing in the trial so far has emerged to validate them. Snoop's hospital story remains precisely what it's always been. His own version, challenged by Knight, impossible for anyone else who was actually inside that room to verify. What's real and what's now sitting before a Nevada jury is Keefe D's own mountain of previous statements. The ones he cannot escape, regardless of how often he insists he never read his own book. So, has Keefe D actually turned against Snoop Dogg inside any courtroom since? Nothing in the trial record so far shows him identifying Snoop as an accomplice, a shooter, or anyone with first-hand knowledge of the plan that killed Tupac. What he has done through the book, through the BET confession, through years of podcast appearances, is pull back the curtain on the entire world. Snoop was part of the label, the rivalries, the violence that Suge Knight built Death Row around. Close enough that Snoop's name was always going to appear somewhere near the blast radius. That's different from a direct accusation, but it's exactly why this story keeps refusing to disappear and still hanging over the case today with every new development in the public eye again. Every time this case takes another step forward, the trial is expected to last about a month. Moving through the same names that have surrounded this story for 30 years, Suge Knight expected on the stand. Tupac's family filling the gallery, documentary crews stationed outside capturing every entrance and exit. Whatever verdict finally comes down, it will mark the first time in nearly 3 decades that a court, not a podcast or memoir or prison phone call, delivers the final word on what truly happened that night in Las Vegas, and whether the shadow that's followed Snoop Dogg through all of this ever had anything concrete beneath it at all.